just gonna make you a quick vid. And if I don't cover what it is you wanted to ask me about, all you have to do is tell me so, okay? So this is a really big file, which is not surprising, and there's nothing wrong with that. I suspect it was part of why we had our online issues. I think this thing was taking up all of your computer's kind of bandwidth. So let's begin by going into image size. Let's go down to 72 pixels, okay? And you'll notice that this is gonna get smaller by half. We're gonna cut the size of this image in half and say, okay. I'm a little surprised this hasn't happened with anybody else's image yet. It may be, people may be cursing me silently at home. But if with a file this large, we can have the DPI make this if it's creating these issues, let's make it a little easier to deal with. All right. So let's talk about a couple things. Let's see. Okay, so she's on her own. She's just floating. She's so happy. And I think what I would probably do at this point, I love that you've labeled everything. Very happy. These not so much, but these are all nice and labeled. I'm going to make her into a smart object. Now you say, Chris, she was a smart object to begin with. See, there they are. And I say, yeah, but let's just do this because now she's kind of compressed into this smart object. So I'm going to do, there are 3 different ways that I will make a drop shadow. The first is to use the effects menu. So I can come over here and I can say drop shadow. And I go into these controls and I'm going to make sure that the preview button is turned on. I'm going to make sure my blend mode is at multiply. And I can choose my color. Let's say I wanted her to kind of glow. So I can do that. And you say, well, I can't see that. If it was a lighter color, I wouldn't multiply it. If it's a darker color, I multiply. If it's a lighter color, I don't. And then you can play with these controls. All right, you can spread it out. You can make it bigger. So if you wanted her to glow, this is kind of how you do it. But if you wanted a drop shadow, I would multiply it and I would use a darker color. So maybe I'd even use a dark blue instead of a black. And I'd change the opacity to something much darker. I could play with the distance, I can play with the spread and hit OK. So that's one way to do a drop shadow. And if you're doing drop shadows on everybody, I'll point out that what's cool about this method, let me come in and make this orange star a smart object. See, when I do that, you notice that his little mask gets tucked in. But now when I go to effects and I go to drop shadow, you'll notice that all of the settings that I created for her drop shadow are on his drop shadow. So if you've got a lot of these to do, this might be the way for you to do it. Let me go in again. Notice that because he is a smart object, I can turn his drop shadow off. I can even throw his drop shadow away. Let's try another way. I'm going to put my finger on the command key and click on him. And again, this becomes a little easier now that I've made him into a smart object. I'm going to grab a new layer. I'm going to come up here to the fill stroke. And I'm going to say, go ahead and fill it with black. I could fill it with a background color or a foreground color or any color I wanted. But now I can take that layer, I can scale it up and move it down. And if I make it into a smart object, I can blur it as much or as little as I want. And because it is a smart object, I have control over how blurry it gets. I can come up here and multiply it, which again, the same principle applies. I would multiply it using my blend modes, and I can play with the opacity. All right, so those are 2 ways to do that. If I wanted them, I think you can see either way I think is working. You can try them both if you'd like. And then the other thing I was going to suggest to you, where is she? Her. So now she's all one piece, right? So if you wanted her arms to stand out from the rest of her body, you could mask out her arms and put them on a different layer and put the drop shadow below, either way that I just showed you, or we can cheat. And this time I'm definitely going to make this into a smart object. All right, and then I'm going to get my brush, and you'll notice that it says nope, can't do it, can't paint on a smart object, but that's okay. I'll make a layer on top. I'll get my brush tool. I'll go get some black paint. I'll make my brush a little smaller. And I'll go in with my brush. I'll get right on the edges. Right on the edges. So I'm cheating. Instead of slipping the shadow under her arms, I'm making the shadow over her arms. And then again, once I have these lines in here, I'm going to make this into a smart object purely because when I go into Gaussian blur, I can do this, right? And then I can say, okay, but if I say, that's too blurry, because I made her into a smart object and used a smart filter, instead of just directly applying the Gaussian blur, I can come into the smart object and kind of do that. And then I can open up this smart object if I wanted to. And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to get my erase tool. And I'll make this a little cleaner. I'm just tapering off the shadow as it reaches her hands, so that it's not quite so heavy-handed. The other way to do this, of course, would be to use a brush that has a taper, but I'm kind of old school. And then at this point, now that I've tapered it, I don't really need the Gaussian blur at all. I can multiply it, and then I can use some opacity. And so now I've got a little more definition. I suppose if I had been smart, I would have used this pink. So let's do this. I'm going to put my finger on the command key again. You see that I've loaded in the marching ants. I'm going to make a new layer. I'll turn this layer off. I'll go get my... You could avoid all of this by being smarter than I was, and just using this pink paint when you paint with your paintbrush. But I'm going to go in and make a new layer because this is a smart object, so I can't paint on it. But I made a new layer, and then I can go in here and say fill, and I can say fill with the foreground color. And so now the areas that I'm adding to her are all done in that same dark pink, so they don't quite stand out quite so badly. And then if I still feel like she needs a little something something, I can take the paintbrush. I'll go up here, I'll make it a little bigger and a little softer, and I'll come up here. Again, I'm making new layers. I don't want to commit too much stuff to any one layer because I might not like it. So if I come in here, and I'm going to be kind of sloppy now. I'm going to go over this edge, which I know I shouldn't do. But because I'm on its own layer, I can really do that. And then I can come and get the eraser tool. I went too far. And I can erase along. So you can really, once you've brought these marvelous little colored pencil drawings in, you can, if you want to, go in and kind of embellish them with the paintbrush tool and the eraser tool. My suggestion to you would be work on layers above. Just keep making new layers. And then when you reach the point where you have all the layers, I'm going to soften this brush up so I get a nice soft edge. Once you reach the point where you're using the Gaussian blur or using the paintbrush tool, you have everything that you need, then I can take all of these layers and one more time, now she's in a smart object all by herself. That's up to you. I like to do that because when I'm done with a character, or when I'm done with a subject, or when I'm done with an element, I like to go in and kind of group it all together. All right. And the other thing we talked about in class that I just want to remind you is if you come to the river, and I'm going to go to the river, and the first thing I'm going to do is, I don't know if you, I'm assuming you want these levels to deal with the sky as well as the river, but if you didn't, if you only wanted the color correction that you've done to work on the river, finger on the Option key and I clip. I think you see it, how it shut down the sky. I'm assuming that this is what you want. If it isn't, that's fine. But then I'm going to put a new layer in between the clipped levels and the river. If you didn't want this, then you would just clip this again with your Option key. And let me go get a nice pale blue, and I'll get my brush, and I'm going to move this in. And you can see, let me zoom in so you can see, that because I'm clipped to the paint layer like this, it's only dealing with the river, and then I can come up to my blend modes and have some fun with my blend modes. If I want to do an overlay, or I want to do soft light or hard light, if I want to kind of change how the river is looking, all I have to do is flip through the blend modes, and it'll only affect the parts, the river, because I've got this paint layer clipped to the river. All right, those are the things we went over in class the other day. If I've left anything out, or if there's something else you'd like to see, just let me know. We can meet up again on Saturday. Hopefully making that file a little smaller might help with the bandwidth, or I'll make you as many videos as you like. Okay, it's coming along wonderfully. Keep going. And this is a good time to finish it, because the last project is going to start to increase in momentum as we go through. So this is probably a good time. All right, thanks.